As the war at sea in World War I intensified, there was a fundamental problem when it came to countering the Imperial German Navy's U-boats. Namely, how do you find them? A submarine on the surface could of course be seen and shot at just like any other ship, but underwater the vessels were of course completely hidden from view. Even a depth charge, or a ram if you were desperate, was completely useless if you didn't know where to actually go to put your weapon to best effect. And as various countermeasures on the surface, such as Q-ships or just having escorts for convoys, drove submarines into conducting more and more torpedo attacks from underwater, as opposed to surfacing to use the cheaper gun, the question that loomed large was, how exactly do we find these things? With visual spotting increasingly out of the question as a reliable method of finding them, the newfangled radio set was out as well, as it seemed that radio signals didn't penetrate water especially well, and German submarines didn't seem to be in the habit of communicating, except by violence, all that often. But it didn't take long for people to start thinking seriously about other potential means of detection. In fact, far from being backward and entrenched in surface warfare only, as some have chosen to depict the pre-World War I Royal Navy, the Navy had in fact been looking into this problem, and some adjacent ones, with considerable effort for almost 2 decades by the time World War I broke out. The solution, as it turned out, lay in sound. That sound travelled underwater, indeed travelled far better underwater than it did in air, was a long-known concept. Experiments to prove this having been done as far back as the mid-1700s, and a number of nations across the world having been seen to use a basic version of what we would today call passive sonar for applications such as fishing. But not much more had been done in this regard until the late 19th century. At this point, a number of rather interesting sound-based underwater devices had been made. One system proposed that lighthouses and lightships would, as well as their lights and foghorns above the water, be equipped with a series of underwater bells. Microphones attached to the hull or suspended from the stern of ships could then reliably hear these signals at far greater ranges than the horns and other devices used at times when lights might be obscured above the water, as wind conditions, for example, could greatly diminish the range of a foghorn. These early hydrophones went through a series of tests, and by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, the Submarine Signalling Company was actively selling its system. The only downside was that these hydrophones were totally omnidirectional. The only way of telling which particular direction the signals were coming from was to actually have 2 hydrophones, one on each side of the ship, then turn the ship until the intensity that was being received by both was identical. And if that intensity got louder, then the signal was coming from ahead, assuming that you were moving forward, and if it was getting quieter, then the signal was astern. The problem here was that if indeed the signals you were detecting were coming from a lighthouse, warning you that there were rocks or some other coastline feature ahead, then turning your ship towards them was not perhaps the best idea, albeit it was certainly better than not knowing at all where the hazards were, and by the mid-1900s, reliable detection ranges of over a dozen nautical miles had been reported, and many coastlines and ships were adopting the apparatus, as a vessel turning towards a lighthouse 10 or more nautical miles away from the coast was perfectly safe as long as it remembered to turn back again. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 prompted still further developments. There was now an interest in echo sounding, which would determine the location of objects in the water, and this interest was rather obvious as it might have allowed the Titanic to avoid the iceberg. Early attempts at echo sounding, before the tragedy, had used explosions to generate sounds that were loud enough to cause echoes that could be picked up. But of course, this system had a limited use. However, another element that was looked at was adapting a basic signalling system, the type that was used by coastal stations for their bells, to a more portable and complex unit that could be mounted aboard ships and used to communicate with other vessels. This would, in theory, allow ships to talk directly to other nearby ships if they detected danger or if they were struck and sinking, and in either case, this could be done without crowding the airwaves and was also somewhat immune to the ship settling deeper into the water, as the transmitter had to be in the water anyway. These efforts would lead first to the Fessenden system, named after its inventor, which allowed the user to transmit Morse code underwater at short ranges. This was important in that it was the first system in which both transmitter and receiver were part of a single apparatus, as previous devices had either received or transmitted, but were not capable of both, a trend that would actually continue for a while, whereas a to and from capacity was of course required for communication. As a way to determine the location of an underwater object, though, it was less effective, mostly because in order to generate the dots and dashes of Morse code, it simply produced continuous sound without all that much in the way of frequency moderation, since, after all you had to hear was a short transmission for a dot or a longer transmission for a dash, and nothing much more refined than that. But a couple of years after the loss of Titanic, and indeed only a few months before the outbreak of World War I, a basic echo sounder using an adapted Fessenden device was developed and tested, and this proved to be capable of detecting an iceberg at a range of about 2 miles. Its primary innovation was the shift to a series of sharp single impulse transmissions, the distinct echoes of which could then be listened for. The Admiralty had immediately ordered the Fessenden communications apparatus for installation in the fleet, although thanks to wartime pressures it would mostly be fitted to submarines only. This relatively quick reaction had been made possible by the Submarine Committee, which had been formalised and working since 1910 to develop both submarine tactics for the Royal Navy's vessels and to work on anti-submarine techniques for use on the Royal Navy's underwater enemies. However, as we've seen with the development of the depth charge, the novel nature of underwater warfare led to attempts to crowdsource ideas, a great many of which were technically good on paper but decidedly less useful in execution, and the vast majority of which were just plain flat-out useless, but all had to be read and evaluated. Separately, however, the torpedo school was installing and modifying a series of different hydrophones for use with a naval version of the underwater navigation bell system that by then was entering commercial use. They had some success in tuning out the noise of the ships the systems were mounted on, which improved sensitivity and lowered the threshold of sound which could now be detected. But of course the whole system was tuned to listen for the frequencies of underwater bells. But at the start of the war, that was about the only system in the fleet which had a chance of listening for the sounds of a submarine moving around underwater. Unfortunately, the system was only fitted to a handful of ships by 1914, and most of those were capital ships which honestly you probably didn't really want to be using in the hunting submarines school of warfare. Thus, at the outbreak of war, the very best submarine detection system available turned out to be a series of posters offering a scale of rewards for civilians or increased prize money to naval crews if they provided information resulting in the capture or destruction of enemy submarines, i.e. spotting them and reporting them. There was even a sliding scale of reward depending on which U-boat you actually managed to report, with U1 and U2, the earliest, being worth £80, all the way up to U21 and its successors, which would net you £160. This reward would later be increased to a flat £1,000 for the confirmed destruction of an enemy submarine by any means. In modern monetary equivalent terms, that's about £50,000, £100,000, and just under £700,000, if you want to get an idea of how big these rewards were. There were even offers of between £5 and £10 for ships that managed to disable or destroy enemy mines. But predictably, this bore fairly minimal results, since of course offering a reward didn't actually solve the problem of how to spot submarines underwater in the first place. It just gave a financial incentive to people to keep an eye out for periscopes, and most crews already had a pretty good incentive to do that. It was called not wanting to be blown up, and or sunk. As the Germans turned more and more from cruiser rules warfare and going after Royal Navy warships to more general and then unrestricted attacks on merchant shipping, the Admiralty, under increasing pressure, combined a number of similar efforts in its purview into the Anti-Submarine Division in late 1916. Jellicoe, by this point the First Sea Lord, appointed Rear Admiral Duff to lead that unit. It aimed not only to centralise the Navy's anti-submarine efforts and in so doing avoid duplication as well as increasing the funding and brainpower available, but they also sought to combine the efforts of civilian scientists and researchers with those of naval personnel. This was overall a good idea, although there would be a fair amount of friction between the two groups, with the naval officers charging that the civilians seemed to be more interested in furthering their own pre-war fundamental research using government time and money, while the civilians countered that the officers sometimes seemed to be only looking for an immediate solution to the detriment of a far more promising option that just needed a bit of work to achieve. The Anti-Submarine Division was to work alongside the broader Board of Invention and Research, which had been formed the previous year, which was a more general attempt to weld civilian and military knowledge together, and was headed up by Admiral Fisher, who, having been forced out of the position of First Sea Lord over the Gallipoli disaster, had jumped at a position which allowed his freewheeling ideas on technological advancement almost free rein. Of all the budget allocation into research into the various sectors covered by these departments, the overwhelming majority went into anti-submarine technology and research, which gives you some idea of just how high a priority it was. This would, of course, being World War I, spawn some rather unusual trials, including one to see if seagulls in the natural population could be trained to find periscopes. This was done by towing a dummy periscope, loaded with food, through the water in and around large flocks of gulls. Hopefully, this would lead to the seabirds associating periscopes with food, and then the sheer numbers of the birds, plus their relatively good eyesight when it came to spotting things in the water, would do all the detection work for sailors at sea. But on the other end of the scale, it would also be the origins of work on a number of other anti-submarine technologies that would not see their application fully realised for decades to come, with some systems not actually entering service until the Cold War, and some of them therefore still having their operational details highly classified. For those of you who served in either submarines or in submarine hunters, you might be interested to know that early work on magnetic anomaly detection, wake tracking, electrical field distortion, blue-shifted optical detection, and underwater thermal tracking all has its origins in the latter stages of World War I under these two divisions. But it would be in the field of underwater acoustics that the most immediate progress was made, although the new unit's efforts started in the most unlikely of places, with someone arguing that perhaps the answer lay in nature, or at least verifying that such a system was even possible could be found in nature first. And thus, the first recorded program in this field, for this division, was the training of sea lions, or possibly seals, it depends on your source. These creatures proved entirely capable of tracking an actual test submarine that was sent out to sea with almost contemptuous ease at a range in excess of 3 nautical miles, which was the furthest they actually tried. But it turned out the sea creatures were also easily distracted, either by playing with their fellows or by the presence of fish, which they preferred to eat. Eventually, the animals were informed by a letter from Rear Admiral Allenby that, while their service to the nation is appreciated, it is now time to let them return to their legitimate business, whatever the legitimate business of a pinniped in UK waters happens to be. The slightly more technological side of these endeavours owe much to Commander C. P. Ryan, who had managed a somewhat indifferent career in the Royal Navy as far as the traditional command route of officers went, but he had also earned much admiration as a mechanical and inventive genius, dramatically improving, for example, the Royal Navy's radio systems in the mid-1900s. But faced with a lack of promotion thanks to others generally just being better suited as leaders of ships and men, he'd retired in 1911 to join the Marconi Company, where his aptitude for inventing interesting devices might be better used. However, with the outbreak of war, he'd answered the call back to the colours, and by 1916 he was in charge of the small Hawke-Craig facility, where, along with the services of the drifter Tarlair, he was working on the detection of U-boats by means of hydrophones. The facility was located on the north side of the Firth of Forth, just a fraction upstream from Edinburgh, which was on the south side, and with so much shipping and some rather deep water channels nearby, it turned out to be the perfect testing ground for early hydrophones. On a good day, some of the experimental devices could actually hear the battle cruiser fleet working their ships up and ready to depart some dozen miles away. An old coastal submarine, HMS B3, and a few other small craft had also been allocated to the facility, and in late 1915, more researchers and funding had been sent his way. Unfortunately, it turned out the facility was one of the major flashpoints for tensions between the civilians and the military, and by the end of 1916, the civilian scientists had been moved off elsewhere. There was, however, an upside to this. During their approximately year-long stay, a significant amount of tooling and laboratory equipment had been set up at Hawke-Craig, which now provided the station with the ability to maintain, invent, and refine its own equipment. One of the most important technologies developed here would be the fish hydrophone, a set of directional microphones mounted in a vaguely torpedo-shaped body which was then towed behind a ship. The walls of the device were made of nickel silver, which was transparent to audio transmissions, and the interior was filled with water. As this water was held relatively stationary, it cancelled out a lot of the noise problems. It was then found that the device could be used at speeds of up to 20 knots, with an operator aboard a ship turning a dial, which, via the cable, rotated the microphones inside to establish a bearing on the sounds that were being heard. Pretty much the only limitation was that a submarine dead ahead or dead astern fell outside of the detection arcs of the device. In many ways, this was essentially the world's first towed passive sonar array, and a number of incremental improvements on it would be developed during the rest of the war. Another station for underwater acoustic research was set up alongside the Harwich Force at the other end of the country, and it had a substation in Dartmouth, which had deep water conditions which were much better for testing than the waters around Harwich. Another success achieved during this period was the development of hydrophones that were sensitive enough to be mounted on the new R-class hunter-killer submarines, with an array of them providing enough directional information to allow the sub to hunt other submarines underwater by these signals alone. However, ongoing tensions between the civilians and military elements at the various research stations would lead to a reorganization of work at the start of 1918 into a single department for experiments and research, and in addition to these official government efforts, there were a number of other research groups centered on various universities and private labs that worked on the issue at the same time. At the conclusion of the conflict, therefore, the Royal Navy had at its disposal a variety of unidirectional, bidirectional, and omnidirectional hydrophones in various formats. There were units that could be towed, units that could be mounted on submarines, units that could be mounted on surface ships, and units that could be set up in wide arrays to allow for rapid bearing calculations. Although the end of World War I had seen a significant reduction in budgets, it also allowed for the examination of a wide range of captured German U-boats and their equipment. Some had been analysed during the war, when they were captured. For example, the gear found aboard the UC-5 and the UC-44 had been judged to be behind British efforts at the time of their capture. But ultimately, there was a pretty simple explanation for why German hydrophones were behind. In the UK, research had focused primarily on means of detecting and destroying submarines, which a hydrophone was part of. In Germany, most of their efforts had gone into making submarines more efficient killers, looking mostly at making the subs quieter, improving periscopes, and improving torpedoes. One thing that immediately became apparent as the latest U-boats were analysed was that the new models were, as mentioned, much quieter than the first versions that had been seen in 1914. And that, along with analysis of U-boats captured in the latter stages of the war, meant that the focus in the last year or so of the war, and then post-war, had been sharply redirected into an active detection system, as it became clear that hydrophones on their own, at least at current levels of sensitivity, would probably not cut it going forward. This would have an additional benefit, as a system that was dialed in to respond to a specific frequency of sound would ignore the majority of other sounds that were in the sea, which had cluttered the receivers of hydrophone operators during the war to their great frustration. The first thing that needed to be decided upon was what frequency range to use. There was sonic, i.e. within the normal human hearing range, ultrasonic, which would require some method of stepping down the received signal, as well as generating the signals in the first place, or explosive. The latter was of course capable of generating the most powerful and therefore most long-distance sounds, but it would of course have a limited usage as it needed physical charges to work, and those charges had to be far enough away from the ship that was using them so as not to damage it. And the sound generated was generally of a fairly broad and multi-frequency spectrum, so that was put on the back burner pretty quickly. The next stage was to put the sonics into the same reserve status, as experiments rapidly showed that not only was the ultrasonic transmission region mostly unoccupied by existing ocean noise, but also, since a variety of boosters and regulators would be needed to make the return echoes usefully audible in any case, regardless of what frequency you were using, shifting the results down to the human audible spectrum wasn't actually all that much extra effort to go through. Although initial efforts revolved around adapting the Fessenden transmitters, largely as they were the only things readily available that were capable of transmitting any useful amount of sound underwater, their utility was limited owing to the aforementioned broad spectrum of the Fessenden transmitter. While work would continue on developing a transmitter capable of producing short, sharp, and powerful sounds of a more uniform frequency, other work based on, of all things, an army system that had used a series of microphones placed along a fixed line to determine the location of enemy field artillery, thus the world's first counter-battery range and bearing detection system, was replicated with hydrophones and first used to locate underwater explosions, and then, it was hoped, to triangulate the location of incoming sounds such as echoes underwater. Since the speed of sound in water was known, the triangulation was a fairly simple calculation. A large-scale test installation was placed on the UK south coast, and this proved the concept at a macro scale. It was able to track the engine noises of German mine layers and the sound of the mines being deployed so accurately that the Admiralty was often furnished with charts of newly laid German minefields before the German mine layers had even returned home. It was also used, among other things, to track the engine and gun concussion noises of monitors as they bombarded German shore positions on the other side of the channel, which gave the Admiralty a good idea of how those operations were going without having to radio and ask. One scientist, a Mr. A.Q. Carnegie, apparently decided he hated other people having the ability to hear, and thus invented an underwater siren. Although, as it turned out, when this was linked up to various other transmission gear, it actually turned out to be remarkably capable of creating a high-frequency, stable and clean signal that, unsurprisingly, could be heard from miles and miles away. But this gear was incredibly bulky and had a relatively short use life. The breakthrough, however, came when work was shared with the French, as two rather inventive Frenchmen had managed to come up with piezoelectric, mica and quartz-based transmitters and receivers, which, combined with amplifiers, offered clear and distinct sounds that were detectable over a dozen nautical miles, and being piezoelectric, could be operated pretty much entirely on electrical power rather than having to use compressed air or other systems like the sirens did. This, when combined with British work on hydrophones and triangulating incoming signals, set everyone off on a hunt for quartz of the necessary size and purity, as this seemed to be the most reliable and durable version of the French equipment. The quartz supply issue, however, was looking a little bit grim, as large and pure enough quartz crystals turned out to be fairly rare. The French scientists solved this problem as well by coming up with a system whereby smaller, thinner pieces of quartz could be embedded in a sandwich made up of steel and later multiple layers of steel and quartz, which vastly reduced the size, although not the purity, of the quartz crystals that needed to be found. Over the course of early 1918, all of this work had been brought together into a system of working transmitters and receivers. This was then combined into a single unit in June 1918, and rapidly this was tested and found to be fairly effective, but only when stationary, as a flow of water across the equipment degraded its capability. But within weeks it was realised that, much like the fish-towed hydrophones we mentioned earlier, if the equipment could be encased in some form of sound-transparent material, with water on the inside thus being still, the device could be used at some speed. Ideally, this should take the form of some form of dome, as that would allow the transducer to be rotated to face in almost any relevant direction. At first, this took the form of a metal framework not unlike half a football, that's a soccer ball to you Americans, covered in canvas, which took a few minutes to soak through completely and become sound transparent, but also allowed the apparatus to be mounted in a long cylinder which could then be retracted into the hull when it wasn't in use. This spawned a sideline of research and development work into the most effective substance to actually make the dome out of, and that would continue for many years. 5 days after the November 11th armistice was signed, that marked the end of fighting on the Western Front, the new setup was tested and achieved a solid echo off of a submerged target at 600 yards range. But the Admiralty, who had been keeping a close eye on the experiments, hadn't waited for these validation trials. Instead, they'd ordered 20 sets off the drawing board back in June 1918, which would be refined through at-sea trials into the first standardized detection system for the Royal Navy, Type 112, which had an operational range in ideal conditions of around 1,100 yards by the time of early 1919 trials. Some of the very earliest systems, which weren't particularly heavily modified, became known as Type 111. The Type 112 was further refined to allow it to be used for both signalling and finding submarines. It turned out eventually that the maximum speed of operation was 20 knots, with a maximum signalling distance of 5 miles, and a detection range that increased to around 2,500 to 3,000 yards after some further refinement work, as long as the ship didn't travel above 15 knots. This was largely thanks to larger 15-inch transducers being installed compared to the 10-inch initial versions. It is thus a rather interesting historical point that if World War I had lasted into the early months of 1919, not only would the German High Seas Fleet have been facing a mass torpedo airstrike, but the U-boats would have found themselves being hunted by what today we call active sonar, neither of which are things we really associate with the First World War. Over in the US, as British and French officers had been eyeing up the prized quartz specimens of various geological museums' mineral exhibits, the Americans had gone off on a side quest to try and circumvent the issue using artificially grown crystals of Rochelle salt, which actually proved to be quite successful once teething problems with purity of manufacture had been overcome. And it was, of course, scalable to be able to be mass-produced. But with the war's end, this particular technology would fall into abeyance in favour of just using quartz systems, as thanks to the Anglo-French advances in using smaller crystals of quartz, it turned out that just cutting and refining quartz was much easier and cheaper, at least in the small quantities needed for post-war research, and outside of these naval applications, the use of Rochelle salt crystals in commercial applications, in things like record players, which would make the cost of the growth vats and processing equipment worth it, were well over a decade away at this point. This, coupled with the US's late entry into World War I and thus its delay in tech sharing with the British and the French, meant that US work on sonar systems was about 6 to 12 months behind the British and French efforts when the end of World War I had seen their funding cut. As the UK was by far the most conscious about the need to have dedicated anti-submarine warfare detection equipment, and with their sets being the furthest ahead anyway, the Royal Navy would continue to lead the field in the development of what they would call ASDIC, what we now call active sonar, during the interwar period, while other nations would gradually turn their attention either to or back to the technology as the interwar period went on. By the time of World War II, the Royal Navy had already gone through almost 24 different types of ASDIC and widely distributed them throughout the fleet. But the evolution of ASDIC and sonar from its early days in the early 1920s to the start of World War II is of course a separate subject to how it got there in the first place, its development, and so for now we'll end that video here.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.